First of all, news of how Mojaloop's ISO 20022 initiative is going. Second, about standardization in general. I'm going to talk about message content, and particularly questions about minimum message content for transmission between ISO 20022 systems. And then I'm going to talk about what we're planning to do in the next program increment. So, quick status update where we are. We've been a member of the ISO 20022 organization since 2022, which is an appropriate year to join it, I think you'll agree. We are represented on the Registration Management Group, which is the top-level committee, the Payment Standards Evaluation Group, the Technical Support Group, and the API Support Group. So we are we think of ourselves as active members of the ISO 20022 community. Bit of history. When Mojaloop first started, we took a detailed look at ISO 20022, and our conclusion was it was not suitable for an inclusive instant payment system. It was the kind of thing that basically you threw a payment over the fence, something might happen to it, something might not, really no idea. Sometimes you got a message back, sometimes you didn't. We wanted things to be a lot tighter than that. So we went and so we said, it's not good for us. It became clear that the world was moving in the ISO 20022 direction. And therefore, towards the beginning of the 2020s, we decided that the sensible plan was to try to influence it in a direction which would improve life, not only for Mojaloop, but also for the financial world in general, because although not everybody had realized it at that time, it was clear that Mojaloop was the way for the financial world to go. So we took a look at it, and this time we took a look at it from the perspective of what would need to happen to it for it to meet the standards of Mojaloop. We joined the ISO 20022 organization, and since then we've done a number of things. First of all, existing ISO 20022 did not have what we call an agreement of terms phase. That is something which enables the parties to a payment to agree that both of them are happy that the payment can proceed before anybody commits funds, and which provides a cryptographic lock to ensure that the terms of the payment can't be changed before they're executed. It didn't have deterministic outcomes for payments, as I said. It just threw things over the fence. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but it was hard to know. We've added to the payment execution and status messages cryptographic locks and keys. That's for PAX 008 and PAX 009, and keys in PAX 002. And we've added expiry times, which means we can set a deterministic outcome for a payment, and everybody can understand that if the payment does not complete within that time, then it gets cancelled. And these have now been included in the published ISO 20022 directory. They are part of the ISO 20022 standard. Now, agreement of terms, I've said, wasn't in there. We're currently working on the definition of new messages to cover this phase. The original suggestion was that we should just have different statuses of the PAX 008 message, but the Standards Evaluation Group did not like that. They said that any financial institution getting a PAX 008, their first instinct would be to execute it, which might not be the right thing to do. So we have separate messages, or we're going to have separate messages. We've produced a business justification, which has been approved. We've extended the ISO 20022 data model to include the proposed new messages. We've submitted a message definition report, which is basically the written statement of what the agreement of terms phase will do. We've been submitted and reviewed twice, and as of now, all the outstanding items have been addressed. We await further reviews. One thing that's worth saying is that although ISO 20022 works on a maintenance cycle which is annual, so anything that's received before, I think, 1st of June each year will be released in the spring of the following year. That's not true for new messages, and we're hoping that the timetable will be very much quicker for these new messages. Currency conversion. I want to talk a bit about that and how we manage that in the modular version of ISO 20022. ISO 20022 does not contain any support currently for retail currency conversion. There are currency conversion messages, but they are basically for settling large-scale trades between financial institutions. We treat it as a request for cover, i.e. an FI to FI message, and that's covered as a PAX 009. And it includes the PAX 009 a link to the main payment to ensure that payment versus payment is maintained. That is, that the conversion is not executed until the payment is executed, and only then. Unfortunately, the PAX 009 message as it originally existed does not support either charges or exchange rates. It's essentially designed for correspondent bankers to pass funds round between each other. We proposed changes to the message, but we got very significant pushback from the ISO community for that. So we arrived at a compromise. And the compromise was to include those values in the agreement of terms messages, but not in the execution message itself. As you know, the execution message has a cryptographic lock, and that should be referable back to the agreement of terms. So any charges should not be a matter for dispute because they will be included in the cryptographic lock. So it's not the solution necessarily that we had hoped for because it's not as consistent as we would like, but it does mean that we can include both charges and exchange rates in the definition of the PAX 009 message. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the business application header. This is a relatively new development in the ISO 20022 standard. It's intended to be a standard way of including information that is about the transmission of the message itself and not the content of the message. So there is a message envelope, which is another new structure in the ISO 20022 specification, which contains a business application header and the message itself as a document element in that envelope. So what happens is you have a single message envelope which contains a standard business application header and a different document depending on what kind of message this is. So the envelope is always the same, the header is always the same, the document is different depending on what kind of message it is. Now, at the moment, we have a number of Moduloop specific fields which we store in the HTTP header of the message. And those are things like the cryptographic lock, not cryptographic lock, that's not what I wanted to say, the destination FSP, the source FSP, information like that. Oh, that's right, sorry, it's not the cryptographic lock, it's the non-repudiation signature that's in the header. Now, the problem with that is that we wanted something that we could align with the message-based existing structure of ISO 20022, because we envisaged, we envisaged a time at which we might be interested in converting back and forth between messages and API calls, or at least knowing how to do that. So the business application header allows us to transfer that Moduloop specific transfer information from the HTTP header, where it currently is, to a business application header. So all of that information can now be contained within a message structure, and we restrict the HTTP header fields to HTTP standard items of information like the URL that's being called, those sorts of things. Now this means that messages and API calls, as I've said, can contain transport information in the same format. So that's that. business application header are not defined for all ISO 20022 messages, but they are defined for the ones we're interested in. So we intend to extend our message definitions for the ISO 20022 standard to include a message envelope and a business application header for each message. Other pieces of news. We have a requirement from, anyone here from Bangladesh? Yes, okay. So we have a requirement from the Bangladesh Bank to include geolocation in our messages. Useful fraud detector to know whereabouts a sender was when they sent the message, and conversely to know whereabouts they received it. It's not currently an element in the PAX 008, the payment message, or in the agreement of terms for the PAX 008, but it is an element in the data dictionary because obviously card messages use it. So our plan here is to adopt the same approach as we did with the changes in PAX 009, that is to add the geolocation to the messages in the agreement of terms for payments. And we can do that as part of the new definition, so we don't have to wait for the revision timetable to happen for that to be accepted. And that's analogous with what happens now. So the geolocation fields in the existing FSP IOP protocol are in the agreement of terms messages, but not in the payment execution message itself. Okay, so that's where we are on the Mojaloop and ISO 20022 road. We don't have any current outstanding change requests with them, but the other area where we will have to start thinking in the reasonably near future is thinking about adding codes to the ISO 20022 structure. Now, a lot of the ISO 20022 messages use external codes, and we will need to make sure, we've done some initial work on this, but we will need to make sure that all of the possible codes that we might want to use are represented in the ISO 20022 external codes. So now I want to go on and talk about standardization. And what I mean by standardization is those of you who've been to these talks before will know that I've spent a little amount of time saying we need an African standard for ISO 20022. We need to have some standard which will enable, at least in principle, payment messages which are generated in any jurisdiction to be comprehensible to someone in another jurisdiction. Now, that doesn't sound like such a difficult thing, and one of the things I've spoken to Robert Achola of African Ender, he's keen to participate. But these things are not easy to do. So I want to propose to you this afternoon a slightly different path that we might take. Now, the objective, in principle, a Mojaloop DFSP and a switch should be able to process a payment which originated from outside a Mojaloop network. And a Mojaloop DFSP should be able to initiate and execute a payment whose payee DFSP is not on a Mojaloop network. Subject, of course, to the ability to settle the payment, and subject to all kinds of other things like non-repudiation signatures and the like. But in principle, I think what we're trying to say is that there should be a set of information which can reliably be present in messages that are exchanged between schemes that are of different forms from each other. Enter, stage left, CPMI. This is a Bank of International Settlements Committee on Payments and Markets Infrastructure. They are composed of central banks. Now, here's again. How many of those central banks do you think are based in Africa? None? One? Any advance on that? Okay. Well, the answer is, it's one. Yes, notion, yes. No prizes for guessing which one, of course. So, as you can tell, it's not likely to be very heavily centered on the requirements of emerging markets, developing economies, and African countries in general, not to mention Southeast Asian countries. However, it does have, so we could not join CPMI. You have to be a central bank to belong to CPMI, which, although we're ambitious for Motorola, we don't see it becoming a central bank in the near future. It does have a thing called a Payments Interoperability and Extension Task Force, and you are allowed to join that if you're not a central bank. So it's set up as what the CPMI calls a public-private partnership. And its job, and now I'm not going to say it, its job is to do CPMI's work for it. So it's to make cross-border payments faster, cheaper, more transparent, and more accessible. And it operates via a set of task teams with specific remits. And one of those task teams, is data harmonization. They produced an initial report. They are producing a revision at the end of this year. And after that, there's a second revision process, which starts early next year. And I'm happy to report that I shall be a member of the second revision process. So we will have a chance, we, the Mojaloop Foundation, and through the Mojaloop Foundation, you, as potential implementers of Mojaloop systems, will have a chance, we hope, to influence what they do and bring it closer to our requirements. So I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about the CPMI data harmonization plan and how I think, or what I think needs to happen to it to make it usable in our context. If you've got questions, by the way, just stick your hand up. It's fine. You don't have to wait till the end. Okay, so what are the areas of focus? Well, it says, what messaging so? I'm now going to quote from what they say they do. What message standards should be used? What should the core message set be? Messages should use ISO 20022 external codes, which gives you a clue as to what the answer to the first question might be. What character set should be used? What time convention should be used? How should unique identifiers be used in payment messages? It should support transparency, include unique account identifiers where possible, identify FIs in a standard way, identify entities involved in the payment, that is the parties to the payment in a standard way, all persons involved in a standard way, a minimum of postal address information, and it should support the transmission of remittance information. Now, some of these are really simple questions. You can answer them quickly. Amazingly, the data standard to be used should be ISO 20022. Who could see that one coming? Not me. Should our messages use ISO 20022 external codes? Again, yes, they should. They had not done quite so well, I think, on the character set that should be used. They propose a simplified Latin character set with a few special characters, but it's Miller. Good question. How will they support any different scripts? Good question. But that's what they say. And what time convention should be used? Well, amazingly, you should use the ISO time convention, which is either UTC or offset from UTC. So you can tell that there's a bunch of high-quality people on this task force. And more interestingly, well, I'll explain why in a minute, we should use unique identifiers in payments messages, and they say we should use the UETR field in the ISO messages. Okay, now let's talk about what they propose for standard messages. Well, first of all, for payment execution, PAX 008, PAX 009, PAX 002. Not a surprise, and thank goodness for that. For returns, they say CAMT 056 and 029 for requests and cancellations, and PAX 004 for payment returns. Now I'm going to come back to that so we can talk about it a bit. Investigations, well, PAX 028, CAMP 110 for investigation requests, 111 for response, and we've got customer to bank messages, which we're not really very interested in. Request to pay messages, again, they propose PAIN 013 and PAIN 014, which I think is what most people who are working in this area at the moment suggest using for request to pay. And they also allow a request to pay cancellation request, which we don't at present support. Then there are bank to customer notifications. Again, not too interesting from our point of view. So, let me talk. Yes? Yep. Should be, sorry, I'm going to wait until you get yours.
You mentioned that a DFSP should be able to, accept some of these messages from an entity that's not even in the module loop system. So, for instance, if DFSP receives a PAIN 001 transaction, so say, for example, is a bank, so would it be, for instance, that the scheme adapter would convert that to a transfer request to them, or can you please explain on that?
No, because we don't talk to customers, like banks.
Okay.
But there is no way for a customer, an individual customer, even a huge conglomerate, to send a message through the module loop system. Module loop system only allows, first of all, financial institutions, regulated financial institutions, and second of all, payment initiation service providers who have a relationship with a financial institution. We don't have anything that enables any customer to send something saying, please make a payment. That's a relationship that exists between a financial institution and their customer. So they might get a PAIN 001, and they would convert that into a payment execution request, which is what the switch would see. Okay? Any other questions? No? Everyone real happy? Oh, sorry.
Okay, just as a follow-up to the question, for the cancellation requests specifically, are there rules or, let me say, framework that needs to be in place, probably how this needs to be related to the end customers and who approves the cancellation requests? So is this something that is being embedded in probably the rules, or there's a framework that needs to also guide this just beyond, execution of the payments instruction?
We would expect to see those defined in scheme rules. Module loop itself, and perhaps this is a defect in module loop itself, doesn't have an explicit, I'm not going to go ahead with this message for most things. So let me take the example of an agreement of terms. It goes to the payee DFSP, the payee DFSP says, yeah, I'm okay with that. The information about the terms of the payment goes back to the payer DFSP, and the payer DFSP says to its customer, are you okay with this? And the customer says, no, I'm not paying that amount. At the moment, in the module loop system, that's it. Nothing happens. It's just that the sending DFSP does not send a request to execute the payment, and eventually the agreement of terms expires. It's as if it had never been. Now, it might be that we should include some message that the payer DFSP, for instance, in this case, can send saying, you know that agreement of terms that you approved, my customer doesn't want to do it. But at the moment, we don't have that. I'm sorry?
You're saying the current module loop setup does not provide for the information that my customer doesn't agree with the agreements of terms of agreement, and therefore won't make the payment. Is there intention or a plan to provide for that feature within the Moja Loop network?
There's no plan at the moment. Nobody has asked us for it. And therefore we haven't done anything about it. I mean, we could if people thought it was important or interesting, but for the moment we haven't.
But don't you think it would be a good idea to have it?
Do I personally? I mean, of course, I am like the Pope. I am the servant of the servants of God. So I don't have any thoughts of my own. Miller. Fortunately, Miller has thoughts for me.
I can give you some of the history on this. The original history on the agreement of terms actually emerged in an odd kind of way from request to pay. What we said was the agreement of terms was a way for somebody proposing to pay a payment to generate the necessary information that they thought that would be needed, and for the fulfilling side to agree to that and put additional information regarding that and return it. Then if the person wishes to proceed, it's their initiative, they can proceed. And if they don't, there's no consequence because no money is on hold. It's not a financial message. And when you think about request to pay, it's like somebody emailing you an invoice. All the details are there. Everything you need to pay it is included. But you're not required to do anything with it. You can throw it on the floor if you choose to. So what we're trying to do is put the control in the hands of the initiator, the payment initiator, which even in the request to pay case is the person whose money is to be paid. So in request to pay, we're generating essentially a frozen agreement of terms, right? We're doing it in advance on the receiving side and sending it across. But we can't compel any behavior from the sending side to one who wants to pay that because it's a non-financial message. There's no consequence to ignoring it. And so this is a way to empower the person who has the account. They feel no pressure to react to this. Just as if they said, I think I want to pay this, but they get back a set of terms that they didn't expect. The fees are too high, or they weren't sure what that was going to look like. And right at the moment they're asked to authorize it, they say, oh, wait a minute, I have to rethink this. I thought I had enough money to pay this, and I realize that I do, except then I can't make this other payment I want to make. And so I choose not to proceed. But I don't owe them a response in that case. We've essentially already proposed something, they've answered us. And so we say, then it's all done. And we wanted to be very careful to keep the agreement of terms and the request to pay as non-financial messages. So there's no financial consequence to that. And that design choice then simplifies the roles on the two sides. Thank you.
Okay, shall I continue? Oh. Okay, so let me then talk about reversals. Now, when we've thought about reversals in the Mojaloop context previously, we have always said a reversal is a payment to the originator. And the way in which we identify a payment as a reversal is in some data fields in the transaction type structure, which say, this is actually a reversal. Here is the transaction ID of the transaction of which it is a reversal. And we've therefore said, since that's the case, why do we need a specialized reversal message? It's just a payment message. And as I say, the rules for each scheme will take care of defining the context in which you are allowed to reverse a payment, where there are changes. For instance, if it's a cross-currency payment and exchange rates have changed, who bears the cost of it, all of those kinds of things. Those are a matter for scheme rules. They are not a matter for motion. However, there is a PAX 004 message in the ISO 20022 thing. Its definition is it's exchanged between agents to return funds after the settlement of credit transfer instructions. Now, we take a pinch of salt with that because, of course, we haven't settled yet, but it wouldn't matter if we had. We have just recorded obligations, but they're irrevocable obligations. And CPMI's comment is, there are bad people in this world. And these bad people do what we do instead of the right thing. Now, I want to say on our own behalf that we don't actually use proprietary coding for this. But nevertheless, they got us bang to rights. That's exactly what we do, and they think it's a bad thing. So, I looked at this from the modular loop perspective. Maybe we should think about it from a non-modular loop perspective, because in this context, we need to be able to think and say, what would happen if a DFSP in a non-modular loop scheme wanted to reverse a payment? The answer is probably they would send a PAX 004, because in the non-modular loop world, that's how you initiate a return of payment. So how would we do this? It's basically, as everybody knows, a specialist form of a payment execution request. It's like a PAX 008, basically. But in the case of the ISO message, it contains lots of extra information about whatever the content of the original payment message was. Now, what we could do is we could extend the transactions resource, the existing resource, so that it accepts either a standard payment execution request or a reversal request. We simply use the one-off keyword in the OpenAPI definition to say you either get a PAX 008 or you get a PAX 004. If we were going to do that, we would need to add the IIPS extensions that we added to the PAX 008 and PAX 009 messages, and we would probably want to add an agreement of terms for the reversal instruction, because we don't do a financial transfer without giving people the chance to see exactly what's involved in it. So that is a reasonable amount of work. We could do it. I mean, there's no technical or conceptual problem with doing it, but it would make a small effect on switch processing. Effectively, what happens when a PAX 008 reaches the switch now, it's converted into a canonical format of processing, internal processing in the switch, which means that we don't have to have different processing for ISO 20022 messages and FSP IOP messages. They just go through a conversion into a standard form. So we would just have a further conversion from the PAX 004 format into the internal format. And that would be relatively simple. Then it would just be processed in the same way as an ordinary PAX 008. But it has a more of an effect, I think, on DFSP processing, because DFSPs will get requests for reversal, or they will get requests to execute reversals. They will need to decide what to do about that. They will also need to decide whether they need to accept an agreement of terms phase for those things, which again doesn't affect what happens in the switch, but does affect what happens with the DFSP. So it's a non-trivial change, I think, for us, and we need to think carefully about whether we really want to, well, sorry, I'm going to rephrase that, because you're right. I was thinking in a modular loop way then, and what I need to think is in a non-modular loop way. It's in the modular loop way, you think, why bother? But we need to answer the question, what would happen if a non-modular loop DFSP sent a PAX 004 to a modular loop scheme? Now, we could just reject it, but that probably isn't a very good thing to do. We probably need to be able to deal with it in some way if we're going to be good citizens of the wider financial world, which of course is part of our ambition. Okay, now let's talk about message content. Now, I've got a couple of confessions to make here. When we did our original ISO 20022 to FSP IOP mapping exercise, what we wanted to do was to confirm that everything that was in the FSP IOP API, the original modular loop API, could be expressed in the ISO 20022 API. And we succeeded, more or less, in answering the question, can an ISO 20022 organization specify all of the information that an FSP IOP organization could? One of the things that we couldn't do, or didn't do, as you've just heard, is we don't have a geolocation in ISO 20022. But fortunately, thanks to the Bangladeshi bank, we are going to have that. So tick that box. But actually now the question we need to answer is a different question. And that is, what's the minimum set of information that a DFSP needs to provide in order for another DFSP to process their payment? And what does the switch need in order to process that payment? What does the payee DFSP need? And also, in these contexts, yeah, what does FATF need? He's a good kicker. Oh, sorry. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's, so you'll be amazed to hear CPMI have come to a decision on these matters. And what do they think the minimum is? Well, there should be a message identification, no argument there. Creation date and time, well, we don't do that, but we don't care. It's a good thing, probably. Settlement method. Now, that becomes more important. At the moment, we say, you know, leave the settlement. There is an ISO 20022 code that says leave the settlement to us and don't bother about it. But we are now going to have more detail, because when we get messages from outside, we are going to need to make sure that they specify a settlement method that we can use, or that our DFSPs can use. UETR. Now, I mentioned before that we may have a problem here. And the problem that we have is the following one. The UETR is the only identifier in the ISO 20022 message set, which is a version 4 UUID, and therefore 36 characters long. All of the other identifiers in the ISO 20022 message are 35 characters long. Who in their right mind would do that? So we have switched across. One of the technical changes we made a year or so ago was we switched across to using ULIDs instead of UUIDs as our unique identifiers. Now, the problem is, if we use the UETR as the end-to-end identifier, then we don't have any way of referring to that elsewhere in our messages. So, for instance, let's suppose that a request to pay gets sent. The subsequent request for terms and the execution message will contain the unique identifier of the request to pay that was used to do it. So that if we ever need to, we can go back and say, why did you make this payment? I made this payment because I got this request to pay. Similarly with reversals. When a reversal goes back, we need to be able to say, this is the unique identifier of the payment for which this is a reversal. So we are using numbers of different identifier fields. Therefore, UETR is a problem for us because it's not, we can't use it anywhere else in the identifier field structures. There is technical people among you. It's possible to convert back and forth between UUIDs and ULIDs. They are both based on large integers, and in fact, you can just move directly, more or less directly from one to the other. However, that makes things not human readable, because if a ULID representation of the same integer, there's no way that even a highly technical person, hard as it may be to believe, to look at a ULID and a UUID and say, do those represent the same large integer? So this is a problem for us. We will need to think about how we would want to solve that. Interbank settlement date, don't care. This is an instant payment system. It clears immediately. Interbank settlement amount, obviously we do care about that, and the instructed amount. So we can now say this was the amount that was originally intended to be sent. This is the amount that will actually be sent. Charge bearer, instructing agent, instructed agent, debtor, creditor, debtor agent, creditor agent, and creditor. I think that's all of them. Now, you'll notice that some of those have dots next to them, and some of them have those rather groovy little arrow things. the distinction that they show is that the groovy little arrow things represent optional elements in the PAX 008 message, whereas the dot ones represent mandatory elements. So essentially what CPMI are saying is you must obviously have the mandatory elements in a PAX 008, and you also need to have this relatively small set, 5 extra items of information. We think are not very interested in instructing agent and instructed agent. But again, in this context, we would need to know what to do if we got a message that had that information in it. Now, we need some additional stuff. Cryptographic lock and cryptographic key, and the expiry time. Now, what's missing from their analysis? Anyone? Up? Okay. Agreement of terms, obviously. Don't give me points for that. What else? Okay. Give up? Nope. That was on the previous slide. No points for that. I lost my train there. Discovery. That's what's missing. Those of you who were in the workshop yesterday where people were talking about payment failures. Now, the study that was talked about in that thing says 97% of payment failures are due to misrepresentation of the payee of various kinds. 97%. And that's what the discovery phase, or what is frequently called the pre-validation phase, does. I cannot believe that something that was a group that was tasked with making cross-border payments easier could possibly have left out that. The business application header is missing. They don't have anything that says whether you should use it or not. Now, that may not be too much of a problem, but it's probably going to be a problem for us. And the other thing is orchestration. Oh, and there's discovery. Fine. I just want to say a little bit about orchestration. ISO 20022, as you know, is based on messages. They use XML as a data format, and typically they're sent to a general inbox, and some process of the recipients picks them out of that and says, what kind of message is this, what kind of message is that, etc. We're based on APIs, so we don't use XML, we use JSON, and messages are sent to a resource endpoint. And what that means is that there's one resource endpoint that receives every request to execute a payment. That's, everything comes to there, but nothing that isn't a request to execute a payment comes there. And that's why, for instance, we can pretend that a PAX 008 and a PAX 004 are both requests to execute a payment. We just attach them to the same resource endpoint, and they come through there whether they are PAX 008 or PAX 004. So that's something that we need to think about. The orchestration is also what enables us to say, first you do this, then you do that. Now, ISO 20022 has written documents that say that, but they don't have actual endpoints. Now, also, ISO 20022 is based on an underlying data dictionary. The organization has published a white paper on how to transform data dictionary elements to JSON. So that's analogous to the process that exists to transform data dictionary elements to XML. But there's no current approved ISO 20022 message for converting between XML and JSON versions of the same content. So anyone who wants to do that will have to, well, it's not hard exactly. Anyone who wants to do that will have to do that for themselves. The other problem, of course, is that converting potentially invalidates the non-repudiation signature, because the non-repudiation signature is not taken on the message, It's taken on the characters of the message. We've been doing some work in the API resource group to say, is it possible to canonicalize messages such that they look the same whether they are JSON messages or XML messages? So there may be something in the future that provides an ISO 20022 approved method of at least preserving non-repudiation signatures between XML and JSON versions of the same message. But that's not there yet, it's early days. It's early days for everything in ISO 20022. Okay, so discovery is a bit of a problem. Oh, I already said that, so I won't say it again. Yes. I'm going to go back.
If we just go back.
Yeah.
If you look at the second last bullet point, that there's no current ISO 20002 method for converting between XML and JSON versions of the same content. Now, for Mojaloop and any other IPS, even though the payments are instant, settlement will always, more often than not, will happen on RTGS, which has to be ISO compliant. Now, if the RTGS on which the settlement is being done on is XML, but the initial file for the instant payments is JSON, and there is no existing conversion method or tool or instrument, how do you reconcile that?
That's because the settlement process does not work by converting messages. What it does is to take information from the ledgers and generate XML messages using that information.
So that's inbuilt within the Mojaloop, the IPS. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Perfect. Okay.
So we don't have to do any converting.
Okay.
We emit information in the format that the RTGS or whatever is doing the settlement expects to receive it in. That's why you have to build that process separately for each implementation, because amazingly enough, RTGSs are not terribly well standardized either. Okay, does that answer your question? Yes.
You mentioned before that no message should be rejected, right? So, for example, if DFSP receives, let me just say the switch, receives an ISO 20022 message, and it instead is not in XML because it also supports JSON, then what happens?
Oh, sorry. What I'm trying to say is no payment should be rejected.
Yes.
So the agreement of terms phase is designed to ensure that both parties agree that the payment can be made and that the payee party commits to executing the payment if it is received within the available time. Now, of course, there are all sorts of reasons why a message might be rejected. For instance, the payment might be above the limit for the scheme, the format of the message might, all of those kinds of things. So we're not saying we never reject a message. We're just saying we're trying to get to a position where we never need to reject a payment.
Yeah, I understand that perfectly.
Okay.
So what happens if the ISO 20022 message is instead JSON based instead of XML? And
well,
this,
whatever it is, it's an HTTP 500, isn't it? Didn't understand that. So that's a synchronous response. You get that straight away.
okay.
Okay. Yep. Oh no. Time is running out. Anyway, yes. The discovery phase allows sending institution to identify the DFSP and allows the beneficiaries account owning institution to confirm the name of the owner of the account. And that's the really important thing. I used to work on M-Pesa, and M-Pesa closed call centers completely when they went to name recognition. Well, you just got something back, and those of you who use M-Pesa or similar things will know you get something that says, you're going to pay Philip Green. Is that right? And you can say, no, I must have entered the number wrong, or whatever. It's amazingly efficient in terms of improving the efficiency and lowering the cost of instant payment systems. And it allows the sender to confirm that this is the beneficiary, and the sender's DFSP can be confident that they're sending to an account which is available. Because the other thing the DFSP says is this account available? Amazingly, there is no ISO 20022 message which is designed for this. Existing messages essentially are designed to confirm or elicit information about a known account. Now, Swift have their own API version of the discovery phase, and they have submitted a business justification for an ISO 20022 API based on this, but nothing has happened yet. So we will engage with the project, but my view is that the CPMI needs to extend its set of messages to include these kinds of discovery messages, but they're not there yet. And certainly we've seen when we've done comparative exercises with IPSs which have implemented ISO 20022, one of the areas, or one of the few areas where there's a great deal of variation is in the messages that they use for the discovery phase. Because, as I say, there is no obvious ISO 20022 message to cover. We'll also raise it with the Data Harmonization Task Force. Yes?
Okay. My question is, in African context, in regards to cross-border payment, actually across East Africa, has this been done? And do we have, because across East Africa, we do have maybe in terms of timelines, how when we make cross-border payments across East African subsection for this case, how is in terms of the timelines?
Not sure, but we certainly had the situation. I'm miles over time, aren't I? People are coming for a completely different presentation. Is that right? Completely different presentation? Yeah, that's what I thought. Sorry, so the answer is, we would propose to continue for the moment with the ACMT 023 and 024 messages, which is what most implementers are using for the discovery phase. Nexus, for the BIS Nexus project, uses those, for instance. So we will continue with those, but that doesn't mean we don't need something properly designed for this purpose. Okay? So I'm not quite sure what I should do at this stage. I've still got a fair amount of stuff to do. I'm going to go through that. So what we need to do in the next phase, I think, first of all, is to align CPMI's message usage with Mojaloop's minimum position and with FATF's recommendation 16, which cross-border payments definitely need. We need to produce a different version of the Mojaloop market practice document. A market practice document in the ISO 20022 world is a document that says, this is how we use the ISO 20022 messages in our scheme. You are allowed to use these fields, you must not use those fields, you must use these fields, that sort of thing. Now, when we originally produced one, which we did for the DLPP scheme in COMESA, we tried to be comprehensive. For the generic Mojaloop one, I think we are going to be much less prescriptive. And essentially we're going to say, for a Mojaloop scheme, you must have these values and that these are CPMI values. All the rest of it can be optional, and then individual scheme implementers will be able to do their own versions of that, which restrict according to their needs. So that's going to be a bit of a change in that there will be a greater distinction between the Mojaloop market practice document and the market practice document which any scheme will use. And the scheme will need to set some time aside, time, for instance, which is related to the time they spend producing scheme rules, to produce a market practice document for their purposes. We'll look at supporting the use of PAX 004 in standard Mojaloop, and we get a standard for the discovery phase. So I'm gonna. Oh, that's it. Phew. Sorry, I'm very late. Much later than I intended to be. I've kept you all from your coffee and cake. So I hope you will excuse me, and thank you very much indeed.